you? Welcome to the Reading Nook. So here in this little segment on my channel is the Reading Nook, where we are reading A Cat's Chance in Hell by Sharon Hannaford at this moment in time. So make sure you've got your drinks and you're good to go. Without choking on your drinks, of course. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of the canvases that we've worked on so far, and all details of current projects are in the comment section below. Big shout out to Sharon Hannaford. Thank you so much for giving me your permission to read this on my channel. It's been great fun, especially the accents. I'm so sorry. As you saw at the start as well, there's a warning. It's for mature audiences, so please, no kids. But other than that, I hope you enjoy. Bye! Chapter 21. They'd been at it for over 4 hours and they'd found absolutely nothing. Between the three teams, they'd covered almost every square inch of the city areas with the strongest ley line activity. They'd unearthed a few things of interest, but there'd been no scent of a demon, ghoul, or unknown vampire anywhere. Carl's team had found a group of homeless humans staying in an abandoned warehouse who told them that half the numbers were missing. At least 20 of the people who usually crashed in that place had disappeared 3 nights ago and had not been seen since. The unspoken consensus between the hunters and their company was that they weren't the only group who had lost members. Dante was obviously picking the easy prey, taking those who wouldn't be missed. There'd been a very slight scent of demon left near the squalid warehouse, which only Kyle had been able to detect, but it ended a few blocks down the street, so it seemed they'd left in a vehicle. At 1:30, Cabby got a call from Byron. She was incredibly frustrated that there was absolutely nothing to report. Byron told her to send 2 teams home and leave 1 on patrol. It was pointless exhausting everyone when nothing was happening. The other 2 teams would still be on standby if things went pear-shaped. He assured her that the S&V staff were monitoring the emergency call lines as well as the police frequencies. If anything strange went down anywhere in the city, they'd know about it. Gabby reluctantly agreed that roaming the streets aimlessly seemed a waste of resources, so she called the other 2 teams to meet at a late-night coffee bar. She sent Marcello and Matt in to get the coffee while the rest of them gathered in the parking lot, as all of them traipsing into the small cafe would have scared the shit out of the handful of late-night patrons. When she told them Byron's orders to head home while her team continued the patrol, there was a huge uproar. Nobody wanted to go home. Carl finally made the point that she was the only one of the hunters with a day job, so it would make more sense for her to go home. Eventually she agreed to draw straws to see who would stay and who went home. Carl grabbed some plastic coffee stirrers and broke them into different lengths. Fergus got to hold them and the 3 leaders chose. Carl drew the shortest straw, so he and his team would stay on duty until just before dawn. The rest would go home, but stay close to the phone. Julius drove Gabby back to the warehouse to collect her car. Then he followed her as she drove back to her house. Gabby could feel the little tendrils of pleasurable anticipation curling in her stomach. At the same time, that anxious tension knotted her shoulder and neck muscles. She didn't know where things were going between her and Julius, but she did know she felt more strongly about him than she'd ever felt about a man in her entire life. She was almost unnaturally drawn to him, and she worried it wasn't real, and then she worried that it was real. Was she falling in love with this man? This man who was a vampire? Is that what this incredible urge to be with him, near him, part of him, was all about? Love? And even if she could figure out her own feelings, what about him? Was she just an amusing fling, a roll in the hay, a notch in the bedpost? Something new and different and therefore interesting? For now, something he grew bored with in time? She'd like to think she could sit down and have a conversation with him tonight. Try and work out where their relationship was going, if they even had a relationship to begin with. But she knew better. She knew the moment that they were alone together, the lust would flare between them, that she wouldn't be able to keep her hands off him. She spent the whole night keeping a tight rein on her actions, all the while wanting to find a dark corner and kiss him into insensibility. The strength for her need for him scared her. She realised she had 2 options: to not invite him into her home tonight, to tell him that she didn't want a repeat of the previous night, to send him back to his estate and keep away from him as much as possible until the war with Dante was over, and then never see him again. Or she could give in to her desire. She could let fate take her where it may, to open her door and body to him and see where it led them, knowing that she may have to pick up the pieces of a shattered heart in the future. When she stopped the Mustang outside her front door, she'd made her decision. She got out of the car and stilled herself, taking a deep, calming breath as he unfolded himself gracefully from the driver's seat of the Audi. She knew the next few minutes were going to be difficult. "Let me go inside and try to talk some sense into Razor first," she said. "I'm sure you don't want to repeat of the other night." She allowed a small teasing smirk to escape. "I'll just wait out here while you tame the monster," he agreed with a slight growl. "But don't take too long." His voice became a sexy purr, with a hint of the accent he got when his fangs were extended. A delicious shiver ran down her spine as she turned and hurried into the house, leaving him in the dark, lounging against the Audi. It took her a while to convey what she expected from Razor to the huge cat's mind. Cat's mind worked so differently to a human's. They saw the world in a much more basic principles. The way she worked with the animals was by using pictures and emotions. Emotions were the easiest for her to control. She could force calm over a panicked or violent animal. She could encourage bravery in a timid animal. She could soothe a disturbed animal. Positive actions were also fairly easy to convey. She could visualize what she wanted the animal to do and give it a mental push to do what she wished. Negative actions were the most difficult. The "don't do this" instructions were quite complicated. First she had to show the action, and then find a way to show the reverse of that action, and then convey that the animal was not to do the action. It wasn't the way their minds tended to work, so telling Razor to not attack Julius was a tricky undertaking. She could feel his fierce resistance to the whole idea. Finally she showed him that if he attacked, then Julius would leave, and so would she. Razor had a fairly well-developed understanding of cause and effect, so that ultimately led to him giving in, though he did so with very poor grace. He stalked off to sulk in the lounge, and Gabby had the feeling that her brand new lounge suite was going to need some repairs in the morning. She was still in a crouch on the floor in the hall where she'd been conversing with Razor when Julius appeared in the doorway behind her. "Amazing," he breathed. "I can sense your power when you use it like that." His eyes held a kind of wonder. "I could taste the emotions you were projecting to him. And then there was a kind of pressure, like velvet brushing against my skin. I've never felt anything like it." He stepped into the hall, put his hand out to draw her to her feet, and laced his fingers with hers. As she straightened, he pressed close to her, crowding her until she was backed up against the wall. His free hand flew to the back of her head, and in a fraction of a heartbeat he pulled the fasteners from her hair and let it tumble down around her face in a gentle chestnut waves. His fingers wove into the strands at the back of her neck and pulled with enough force to tilt her head back, raising her mouth to where he could capture it with his own. "I can feel yours too," she said in a breathy whisper, as she watched his lip part to reveal his fully extended canines. "When you call to others, it feels like the tingle in the air before a summer storm." And then his lips were only millimeters from hers. He paused there and drew a slow lungful of air into his chest through his nose, as though relishing the scent of her. She unlaced her fingers from his and plunged both her hands into his hair, dragging his head forward so his lips finally met hers. She felt him try to temper the joining of their mouths, try to take her mouth gently, but she was too far gone. And as their lips met, tongues tangling in a hard, desperate kiss, she felt his sharpened canines nick her tongue and pierce her bottom lip. His body shuddered against hers as the metallic taste of her blood swept through both their mouths. He groaned, plunging his tongue more roughly into her mouth, sucking at the smallest injuries, his hands now roaming freely over her body, removing weapons and sheaths with hurried dexterity, and then starting on her clothes. The difference in their heights made kissing an almost gymnastic feat. So once he'd removed everything but her lace panties, he'd lifted her up. She curled her legs around his waist, luxuriating on the feel of his tightly muscled body close against her bare skin. The coarse fabric of his shirt chafed pleasurably against her nipples, bringing them to a hard, aching point. She realised she needed to get rid of the material between them, and only barely stopped herself from ripping his shirt off again. She managed to control herself enough to pull the shirt over his head, then pull herself tightly as she could against him, as she pressed little biting kisses along his jaw towards his ear. "Bedroom?" he asked hoarsely. "Down the corridor, second door on the left," she whispered as her lips found his earlobe. "The rest of this I will not read. I do not want to get banned from YouTube." After the hanky-panky. They did make it to the bed at some point, Gabby realised, as she finally became aware of her surroundings again. They were both entangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, and his arm was wound tightly around her waist, holding her close to him. The bedside clock told her it was a few minutes before 3 a.m. She'd lost track of an entire hour. She was still breathing heavily, and her heart was pounding like she'd run an obstacle course twice. She knew they both could do with a shower, but she wasn't sure how long it would be before her arms and legs would obey her commands. She could still feel the burning tingle where his fangs had pierced her inner thigh, and she felt a blush trying to rise in her cheeks at the memory, though her treacherous body clenched in recalled ecstasy. His arms tightened around her. "Shower?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. "When I regain some control of my muscles," she agreed. "You can go first while I recover," she suggested, knowing what was likely to happen if they got into the shower together. "Or," he said in a seductive purr, "I can carry you." She chuckled weakly and struggled to a sitting position. His arm released her, but his deft fingers began to trace a path up and down her spine. "So many scars," he said softly, as he traced a jagged one about 3 inches long across her left shoulder blade. She snorted softly. "Goes with the territory, as they say." "I wish I could erase them for you," he said, sitting up behind her and kissing the imperfection. "Each one has a story," she said thoughtfully. "Many of them are lessons I had to learn the hard way. Not sure I'd be willing to give them up." "Leah, my warrior," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And you?" she asked him. "How many battle scars do you have?" "No visible ones," he said enigmatically, but continued before she could interrupt. "Vampires don't scar unless the injury is inflicted by silver or the wound comes into contact with salt water." "Oh," she asked, surprised. "So Fergus's face?" She left the question hanging. Julius took a breath, and she could feel a sense of sadness surrounding him now. She wondered briefly at her ability to feel his emotions, but didn't think for a moment that she was imagining it. It's simply too strong to ignore. "He poured salt into the wound before it healed," he answered slowly. "Like you, he wanted to remember the lesson." She knew that was all he was going to say on the matter, and that whatever the sadness was about, it was old and deep-seated. She wouldn't push him now. She'd pry it out of him some other time. She peeked at him over her shoulder. "Shower?" she asked with a raised eyebrow, then dragged herself off the bed and sauntered naked into her ensuite bathroom. As she turned on the water, she heard her phone ring. Her pulse leapt, even though she realised it wasn't her phone ringing. She moved back to the doorway and watched as Julius scooped up his pants from a pile on the floor and found his phone. He was gloriously naked, she thought. He checked the caller's number. "It's just the estate," he told her. "Go and shower. I'll join you as soon as I'm finished." She nodded and retreated to the steamy warmth of the shower cubicle. When she heard the shower door open, she scooted over to make room for him, but instead of joining her, he was already dressed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have to go. There's been some kind of accident at the estate." "Do you need some help?" she asked, all business now. "I can get dressed in a few minutes." He reached into the shower, putting his hand behind her head and drawing her close enough for a kiss, heedless of the water soaking his shirt sleeve. "Thank you, Leah," he breathed. "But no, it'll probably be better that I deal with this one without any distractions. Get some sleep. I'll call you and give you an update before I crash for the day." In the next instant he was gone. Just the memory of the feel of his lips remained in the shower with her. She unhurriedly finished her shower, pulled on some loose cotton pyjamas, and then went to make a cup of hot chocolate and soothe Rose's ruffled ego. The thought of her bed without him in it was strangely unappealing, but eventually, with nothing else to do, and at Rose's insistence, she went back to bed and crawled under the covers, making sure she had her phone within reach. The atmosphere was grim when Julius strode into the manor house. Alexander was waiting for him, and the rest of the guard, except for Charles, Quentin and Tabari, who were still out on the patrol with Carl, were milling uneasily around on the ground floor. They came to attention when Julius entered, and the house went silent. "Come," Alexander said shortly, and started up the stairs. Julius followed him wordlessly. At the top of the stairs, Alexander turned and headed towards Julius's newly refurbished office. The door had been rehung, and most of the display cases and shelving had been fixed and refitted. The mess of glass and metal and wood had been cleared away, and the new desk stood in exactly the same position as the old one. Julius had left instructions for Sebastian to set up his new computer in the office tonight, and to make sure his internet was running and the firewalls were in place. The computer was ready on his desk. Everything looked in place exactly as it should be, except for the blood, and the smashed glasses, and the decapitated body, and the head. Julius felt an almost physical punch in the chest as he took in the sight. If he had had air in his lungs, it would have left him in a swoosh. "It's Sebastian," Alexander said quietly when Julius didn't speak. "I came up to check if he'd made any progress on tracking our traders. I said he could work in here once he's finished setting up your computer." Julius felt a cold, dark rage building inside him. He moved to the head, crouching down to turn so he could see the features. Sebastian's frightened eyes stared back at him unseeingly. The head hadn't deteriorated yet. Sebastian was such a young vampire that his body would decompose like that of a human. At least it made the identification easier. The scene in the office showed that Sebastian had tried to fight his attackers off, but he hadn't been able to put up much resistance. "Who could have done this?" Julius asked in a tight voice. Alexander sighed and slumped against the wall near the doorway. "I don't know. I've kept everyone away from here. No one else has been in the room since I found him except me and you. I haven't told him it was murder. I gave them the story I gave you on the phone." He paused, tension tightening the muscles along his jaw. "I think it was someone on the inside, Julius. There are no unknown scents in here, or anywhere else in the house. Not that I can detect anyway." "Can only be one of a handful of people then," Julius said. "Most of the guard was with us tonight. That leaves us with the household staff and the werewolves." Julius moved across the room to inspect the weapon collection. "The Jambaya dagger is missing," he said shortly. "That means the murderer didn't come prepared, so it's unlikely it was an outsider." "There are two more things," Alexander told him. Julius braced himself as Alexander continued. "Gregory is missing. No one has seen him since midnight, when Claudia heard him take a call on his personal phone." "And the second?" Julius asked flatly. "Sebastian's computer is gone." Julius sank in his new office chair, only vaguely aware of the splatters of blood smearing against his pants and shirt. There was only one reason someone would murder Sebastian and steal his computer. Sebastian had found another traitor in the clan, and the traitor had killed him before he got a chance to tell Julius, and everything Sebastian had found would have been on this computer. "I think maybe we should get Carl in here," Alexander said cautiously. "He'll be able to scent things you and I can't. His nose is so good he could tell you how many hours it's been since the scent was left. He could help us know who was in here the last few hours. The scent is particularly muddied in here from all the workers who've been in and out fixing the room up over the last few days." "Call him," Julius said shortly. "It would be best to have the rest of the guard back here anyway after this. If he only finds vampire scent in here, I will personally be questioning everyone who's been on the estate in the last 24 hours. Alexander pulled his phone from his pocket. Kyle answered almost immediately. Once Alexander explained this situation, Kyle agreed to pack up and get to the estate as quickly as he could. They'd encountered nothing of the excitement since the others had left. "Eerily quiet," Julius heard Kyle describe it to Alexander. "As though something big is being planned which has called in all of their resources. I'm just hoping it's too late in the night to start something." Alexander muttered his agreement and disconnected the call. "Call down to the guard station and ensure that Carl and the guard are let in. Tell them that no one is to leave the estate without my express permission. Then send the household staff and any off-duty wolves to the gymnasium and make sure they are kept under guard. Tell them nothing." Alexander nodded and left the office. Julius swiveled his new, now blood-stained office chair and bent to open a cupboard, taking out a wine glass and a bottle of red wine. He put both on his desk, avoiding the pooled drying blood, and decorked the bottle with a quick twist of a corkscrew from his top desk drawer. As he poured the burgundy liquid into the crystal glass, his thoughts turned back to Gabby. He wondered if she was asleep. He resisted the urge to call her. It wouldn't be fair to wake her up if she was getting some rest. But the urge to hear her voice was almost overwhelming. He thought his draw to Simone was the strongest thing he'd ever felt for a woman. That he'd never felt such an insane urge again. In fact, he'd schooled himself to never let another woman have that kind of hold over him again. Look at what the affair with Simone had gotten him. But his willpower just wasn't enough to rescue him from Gabby's lure. She was his siren call. His resistance was a pile of breadcrumbs. He still didn't know how she would react to the thought of a relationship with him. Physical chemistry between them was as obvious as the lean on the Tower of Pisa. But he had yet to introduce her to the reality of his life. She'd seen the girl, his feeder, being escorted home a few nights ago, and had apparently realised what she was. But Gabby had never actually seen him feed, except for his feeding on her. His groin tightened at the thought of the taste of her. The taste of her blood was almost addictive, far more deliciously potent than the blood of a normal human. He hadn't told her that he'd woken up midday after taking her blood, which was unheard of for a vampire who'd crashed for the day. Julius was able to keep himself awake throughout the daylight hours if he needed to, but once he let himself sleep, he had no control over when he woke, and he rarely woke more than an hour before sunset. He had never woken at midday. It was the opposite of what he'd expected. As she had a certain amount of vampire in her DNA, he had expected her blood to be less potent, less nourishing for him. Vampires couldn't feed on each other. They could take blood from each other. It gave an amazing edge to sex, or it could be used as a way of showing dominance. But it didn't actually provide nourishment. Something contained in the human blood was needed, but her blood had been his version of Red Bull. It was incredible. It would probably scare her to know how incredible he found it. But in reality, even if she was willing to let him feed from her, he'd still need to take the blood from other feeders. Even though he didn't need to feed every day, at times he could stretch to every third or fourth day. Over time it would weaken her, and there would be times that she couldn't come running when he needed blood. She had her own life, and he wasn't going to interfere with that. He also knew how he would feel if he would have to watch her have any kind of close interaction with another male. The jealousy would be hard to contain. At that thought, he wondered if any of the feeders had been brought to the estate tonight. He'd have to get Alexander to check. They had 2 or 3 resident feeders, people who lived on the estate and worked here and studied during the day, were available to Julius and his staff for feeding when necessary. Julius encouraged his staff to go off estate and find donors in the clubs and bars of the city. He enforced a strict code of conduct when it came to feeding. Donors had to be willing, there was to be no violence in the act, and the donors' memories had to be cleared of anything to do with being bitten or fed on. But occasionally someone needed blood urgently, or didn't have time to go hunting. And this was what the feeders were for. He only allowed the feeders to stay for a few months at most. They usually left with some memory about undertaking a medical experiment and a decent bank account, so it worked out for all parties concerned. Julius wasn't sure what Gabby would make of that, but they did have to feed somehow. He was trying to do it in the most humane way he could. Carl's voice downstairs pulled him from his contemplation, and he drained the last few drops from his glass. As Carl walked into the office and stopped to stare at the head and the body on the floor. "Time to change office, I think," he said to Julius with an eyebrow raised in surprise. "This one seems to attract violence." Julius refilled his glass and looked inquiringly at Carl. "No thanks, Julius. I'd rather not dull my senses tonight. I have a funny feeling there's more going on than we realise." He paused, closing his eyes and drawing in a deep breath through his nose. "Alex said you want me to see what scents I can trace in here?" "Please," replied Julius. "There are so many in here at the moment. Though our sense of smell is enough to identify most of them, it's hard to tell how long it's been since they were actually in the room. It would help us immensely if you could tell how many people were here in the last few hours." Carl nodded. "I could probably do that, though if I haven't been close to the person I may not be able to tell you who it was. But I could tell you if it was a human, were, or vamp. Do you have any idea when Sebastian was killed?" Carl started moving around the room, his eyes half closed in concentration, carefully avoiding the pools of drying blood. Julius could see his nostrils flaring as he breathed in the air and all of its scents. He was still alive at a little before midnight. Claudia heard him making some kind of noise and went to check on him just before she went off duty. She said he looked pleased about something but wouldn't discuss it with her. She incidentally heard Gregory on the phone on her way out, and that was the last anyone had heard of either of them. Carl completed a circuit of the room and began a second round. "So the scent you're after will be less than 4 hours old?" he mused, mostly to himself. So Julius didn't reply, but drank his wine and attempted to keep a and attempted to keep a leash on his rage. "There are only 4 cents newer than Claudia's," Carl said as he got back to his starting point. Julius held up his hand to stop Carl from continuing as they heard soft footsteps approaching. Alexander entered the office again. "Everyone's under guard in the gymnasium," he informed Julius, giving Carl a nod in greeting. "That's probably not necessary," said Carl. "Unless you or Alexander killed Sebastian, the killer is Gregory." Julius saw the shock hit Alexander as hard as it hit him. It felt like some kind of spell had been cast on him, freezing him in place, not allowing his body to move while his brain tried to comprehend the impossible. Carl seemed to sense the anguish and walked over to the desk and refilled Julius's half-empty glass. Minutes must have passed before Julius finally unfroze. Bone-deep sadness dragged at him as he finally picked up the wine glass and drained it in a single swallow. "You're absolutely sure?" Alexander asked in an emotionless voice. "Yes," Carl said. There was sympathy in his voice. "Sebastian must have scratched or cut him or something. I can scent small traces of his blood in here." As the shock wore off and reality returned, Julius realized that they were holding pieces of a puzzle that weren't making any sense. They needed more puzzle pieces before the whole picture started to merge. What did Sebastian find that had him excited, he demanded, from no one in particular, banging his fist on the desk in frustration. "If it was on his computer, we'll never know," Alexander said bleakly. "Gregory must have taken it with him." "So, whatever he found was worth killing for," Carl prompted. "Do you think he found other traitors in your clan?" "That's possible," Alexander conceded bleakly. Carl started pacing on the far side of the room from Sebastian's body. He mused as he paced. "He was a computer geek, right?" He looked to the vampires for their affirmations. "Have either of you two checked your email or the intranet to see if he forwarded you anything?" Julius could have kicked himself that the idea hadn't occurred to him. His hand twitched and the new computer purred to life. A few quick clicks and he found what they were looking for. "You're right, there's something here from Sebastian." Feeling of dread washed over him as the other two rushed around to watch as Julius opened the first of several video and audio clips. Carl knew there was trouble brewing seconds into the first clip. Julius's face was a mask of undiluted rage. Alexander's was pinched with disbelief and betrayal. It was clear now that Gregory had been with Stephen and Genevieve, as well as a werewolf in Julius's employ. They'd all been feeding information to Dante's clan and taking orders on ways to undermine security and stir tension in Julius's clan. Somehow Gregory had known that his cover was blown, so he'd killed Sebastian, grabbed his computer and ran to Dante. As Julius and Alexander looked at each other in rage and horror, a sudden thought occurred to Carl. "Sebastian was the one who tracked Gabby's details for you, correct?" he asked, tension locking his jaws, making it hard to form words. "Yes," Alexander replied, slightly confused. Carl knew the moment that Julius caught up to him, as the wine glass Julius was holding exploded, fracturing into thousands of tiny shards. The remaining wine splashed onto the desk to mingle with the giant blood. "Her address is on that computer," he said hoarsely. Before any of them could react further, a phone rang. Carl recognized his own ringtone. He patted his pocket before pulling out his phone. He glanced at the caller ID. "It's her," he breathed. Bum bum bum. It's all going to kick off next time. See you later. Bye.